Medicare for All sounds nice, but here's the reality. For a few months now, Democrats and Democratic Socialists have been building a case for Medicare for All, and it's an appealing one. More is pointed to the defense budget, point to billionaires who pay a smaller effective tax rate than the average worker. Added up, the argument goes, and you've got guaranteed health care for every American, paid for by cutting waste and asking the wealthy to pay their fair share. It's a compelling pitch, but it's also not quite how the math works. What Medicare for All would actually cost. Independent estimates, not from insurance industry lobbyists, but from groups like the Urban Institute and the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, put the price tag at roughly 25 to 36 trillion dollars over 10 years. That's somewhere around 2.5 to 3.6 trillion dollars a year in new federal spending. One study, often cited by advocates, estimates a much lower cost, but even that study's own authors state elsewhere that the plan would require $13.5 trillion dollars in additional financing over a decade, nearly 5 times higher than the number usually quoted from it. So the defense budget doesn't close the gap. Total U.S. military and war-related spending runs about, $1.25 trillion dollars a year. That's a genuinely enormous number, and there's a legitimate conversation to be had about whether all of it is necessary. But even if you eliminated the entire defense budget, every dollar, every contract, every base, you'd only cover about one quarter to one third of what Medicare for All would cost. No serious proposal calls for zeroing out defense entirely. So let's be clear about that. So realistic cuts would close an even smaller share of the gap. Taxing billionaires help. It doesn't solve it. Okay. So the most ambitious wealth tax proposals on the table from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are projected to raise somewhere between 2.6 and 4.4 trillion dollars total over 10 years. That's roughly 260 to 440 billion dollars a year. Independent estimators, including the Tax Foundation and Penn Wharton, generally project real world collections would come in lower than the campaign's own estimates once you account for tax avoidance and legal restructuring by the wealthy. It's going to go to court. Put the maximum realistic defense cuts and the most optimistic billionaire tax revenue together, and you land somewhere around 1.5 to 2 trillion dollars a year against a program that costs 2.5 to 3.6 trillion dollars a year. It's a real substantial down payment, not full financing. Every serious Medicare for All proposal, including Bernie Sanders' own, includes some form of broader tax increase beyond just the Pentagon and billionaires to close the remaining gap. So you ask, why do other countries manage it? Here's the part that complicates we simply can't afford an argument. The United States already spends more on health care as a share of its economy than any other advanced country in the world and gets worse outcomes for it. Lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality rates, all while spending more per person than nations with full universal coverage. The obstacle to universal health care in America has never really been a math problem. Research points to three real structural reasons: an unusually individualistic political culture that resists government involvement in personal life, a private insurance industry that spends enormously on lobbying to protect its position, over $1 billion in a single year during the fight over the Affordable Care Act alone, and political institutions, the filibuster being chief among them, that are simply built to make sweeping reform difficult to pass. So here's a more honest middle ground. Between nothing changes and full Medicare for all, there's a real already proposed option worth taking seriously, and that would be fixing the specific hole in the current system rather than replacing the whole thing. Roughly a dozen states never expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, Texas being one of them. In those states, up to 2 million people fall into what's called the coverage gap. They earn too little to qualify for ACA marketplace subsidies, but they earn too much for their state's stricter Medicaid rules. They're not lazy, they're not uninsured by choice. They're stuck in a gap created entirely by their state legislature decision not to accept federal expansion money that's already sitting on the table. It's there if they want it, but they don't take it. A federal public option, automatic premium free coverage specifically for people in that gap while leaving private insurance and employer coverage untouched for everyone who has and wants it, was actually proposed in a recent White House budget. It didn't require blowing up the existing system. It still isn't cheap. Filling that gap alone would run tens of $billions a year, but it's a fraction of the cost of full Medicare for all, and it directly targets the people the current system generally fails. So, what's the bottom line here? Okay, supporters of Medicare for all aren't wrong that defense spending and billionaire wealth represent real underused sources of revenue. They are wrong when they suggest those two sources alone cover the whole bill. The honest debate isn't can we afford any of this? It's who pays the remaining half? And is a full system overhaul worth the economic disruption compared to a smaller targeted fix that could pass with a simple majority instead of a supermajority we may never have? That's a harder conversation than a bumper sticker, but it's the one actually worth having. And I thank you for listening. You have a wonderful day.